My boyfriend's mother wanted me out of his life. She ended up losing her son instead. Colin and I had been together for 2 years when I first met his mother, Diane. We'd been moving slowly because he warned me she was difficult about girlfriends, but I thought, how bad could it really be? I worked as a physical therapist at the rehabilitation center downtown, had my own apartment, and my parents owned a small bakery that had been in our neighborhood for 20 years. Have you ever had someone try to actively destroy your life just because they thought you weren't good enough for their son? Well, I did. I thought breaking up with Colin was the hardest thing I'd ever do, a painful escape from his mother's relentless cruelty. But then, 6 months later, she showed up at my workplace, a shell of her former self, begging me to save him from a path she'd paved for him. You won't believe what happened next. Colin was just finishing up his residency at the hospital, and we were talking about moving in together, planning our future. His mom, Diane, wanted to meet, and Colin picked this fancy restaurant he knew she liked. That should have been my first clue. She showed up 20 minutes late, which, okay, not a big deal usually, but her first move was to look me up and down like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Then she turned to Colin and, completely ignoring me, asked him, "Why didn't you mention she was ethnic?" "I'm Italian." Italian. The rest of that dinner was just a masterclass in passive aggression and outright insults. She kept asking what my real job was because apparently physical therapy wasn't a career for someone dating a future doctor. She actually asked if my parents were legal citizens. Can you believe that? My parents were born in Philadelphia. Then she looked me dead in the eye and asked if I was dating Colin for his money. Honey, he was still in residency, making way less than I was. Colin, bless his heart, tried to redirect the conversation, but she'd just talk right over him, like he wasn't even there. And that was just the first meeting. Every interaction after that was a step down into absolute hell. She'd call Colin constantly when we were together, loudly telling him about some nice girl she'd seen at her country club, someone he really should meet. When he'd tell her he was with me, she'd just sigh dramatically and say, "Oh, that's just temporary, dear." One time, she even showed up at his apartment when I was there, feigning shock. "Oh, you're still around, Natalie?" Then she launched into this whole story about Colin's ex, Rebecca, how Rebecca was getting divorced and had been asking about him. Oh, and Rebecca's father was a judge. So helpful for Colin's career, she'd chirp. Colin told her to stop, to his credit, but she just waved her hand and said, "I'm just making conversation." For his birthday, she threw him this huge party, and get this, she gave me the wrong address. I showed up 2 hours late, frantic because Colin had called me, genuinely worried. She used that moment to announce to everyone, in this saccharine voice, that I couldn't even bother to show up on time for important events. Colin actually corrected her in front of everyone, which was a small victory. But her response? Oh, mistakes happen. Then she started calling me the wrong name. Bethany, Catherine, Jessica, anything but Natalie. Every single time, Colin would correct her. Every single time, she'd pretend she was just bad with names. Except, somehow, she remembered every nurse, receptionist, and barista's name perfectly. It was a calculated cruelty designed to make me feel small. The confrontation that finally ended everything, that was a doozy. Colin was on call at the hospital, and Diane showed up at my apartment. "We need to have a woman-to-woman talk," she said, like this was some heartfelt chat. She told me Colin would never marry someone like me because I didn't understand their social circle. She said my parents were nice people, but they were shopkeepers, and that wasn't the kind of family connection Colin needed for his career. And then the kicker. She looked me in the eye and said, "Your parents probably pushed you to date above your station because immigrants always want their kids to marry up. My parents aren't immigrants, but whatever." Then she added, "They must be so proud you trapped a doctor, but Colin will wise up eventually." That's when I lost it. Everything just snapped. I looked at her, and the words just tumbled out. I told her she was absolutely right. Colin did deserve better. He deserved better than having to manage his mother's insane jealousy for the rest of his life. I told her any woman who married him would be signing up for decades of her manipulation, and I wasn't interested in that life. I looked at her, feeling a strange mix of triumph and absolute exhaustion, and said, "You win. I'm done." And she actually smiled, a genuine, satisfied smile. "I knew you'd see reason eventually," she purred. About an hour later, Colin called me from the hospital. His mom had been texting him, spinning this wild tale about how I'd shown up at her house, said horrible things, and then announced I was dumping him. I told him what actually happened. He drove straight from the hospital, still in his scrubs, and showed up at my door. He was crying, begging me not to let her win, but I was just exhausted, physically, emotionally, utterly drained. I looked at him, the man I loved, and told him, "I love you, Colin, but I can't spend my life fighting your mother for basic respect." We broke up that night. The next day, Diane called Colin, sweet as pie, checking in, and then had the audacity to suggest he reconnect with Rebecca. That was it for him. Colin completely shut down. He stopped answering Diane's calls. He picked up extra shifts at the hospital, practically living there to avoid going home. He started sleeping in the on-call room even when he wasn't on call. His colleagues told me later he lost 15 pounds in the first month alone. His dad, Frank, tried to get him to come to family dinners, but Colin refused if Diane would be there. She, of course, insisted he was being dramatic and would get over it. 3 months after our breakup, Colin made a mistake during a procedure from sheer exhaustion. Nothing serious happened, thankfully, but it scared him, really shook him to his core. His attending physician told his parents Colin was showing signs of severe depression. Meanwhile, life was moving forward for me. 5 months after the breakup, I met James at my cousin's wedding. He was a firefighter, coached Little League on weekends, and his mother immediately invited me to Sunday dinners. It was easy, predictable, safe. Colin somehow found out through mutual friends. His friend told me Colin hadn't been to his parents' house since we broke up. Then, 6 months later, things got weird. Diane started showing up at my work. First, she just watched me from her car, parked across the street. Then she actually came inside and sat in the waiting room, just staring. Finally, she approached me, tears streaming down her face. She begged me to take Colin back. I just stared at her. Diane, standing in my workplace waiting room, her face streaked with tears. My first instinct was to call security. My coworkers were all watching, whispering, wondering what this woman, who'd spent months making my life a living hell, was doing, now begging me to save her son. She looked smaller than I remembered, like something inside her had just broken and left her hollow. I walked past her toward the break room, and she followed, her heels clicking against the tile floor. My supervisor glanced up from her desk, eyebrows raised, but I shook my head slightly, signaling I could handle it. I refused to talk inside, so Diane followed me to the parking lot. She was saying Colin hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks, that he was living at the hospital. He wouldn't see anyone. Her voice cracked on his name, and I felt my chest tighten, despite everything she'd put me through. I looked at her, my voice low and firm, and told her, "You got exactly what you wanted. You need to leave me alone." I unlocked my car, but she stepped closer, blocking the door. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeve, and said Colin made another medication error last week, a serious one that nearly hurt a patient. I pulled away, but she kept talking. The hospital was talking about ending his residency entirely, not just medical leave. She was scared he'd lose everything he worked for. Her makeup was running down her cheeks in black streaks, and part of me felt this ugly, satisfying jolt seeing her so broken, which, of course, immediately made me feel awful. I got in my car and locked the doors, leaving her standing there, sobbing in the parking lot. I drove home shaking, because part of me, a deep, irrational part, still wanted Colin to be okay. But another, much angrier part was furious that Diane thought she could just use me again, like some kind of fixer. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. James was cooking dinner when I got there, and I couldn't even explain what had happened without just breaking down and crying. He turned off the stove, guided me to the couch, his hands steady on my shoulders. James just held me while I told him about Diane's visit. He was quiet for a long time before asking, softly, "What do you want to do?" I told him I didn't know, and it was the truth. 6 months ago, I loved Colin enough to imagine marrying him. James didn't say anything else, just rubbed small circles on my back while I tried to stop shaking. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself looking at Colin's social media for the first time since the breakup. His last post was from 4 months ago, a bland hospital photo. He looked tired even then. His face was thinner, and there was something empty in his eyes that wasn't there before. I scrolled through older photos and saw us together at a restaurant, both of us laughing at something off camera. I closed the app and just stared at the ceiling until morning. The next day, Diane called my phone 12 times before I finally blocked her number. Then she started calling the rehab center, asking for me, until my supervisor pulled me aside and asked if I needed help with a stalking situation. I briefly explained about Colin's mom, and my supervisor, bless her heart, said she'd handle it if Diane showed up again. By lunch, 3 of my coworkers had asked if I was okay, and I realized everyone in the building knew something weird was happening. I finally agreed to meet Diane at a coffee shop, just to make her stop bothering my workplace. She showed me photos of Colin on her phone, and he looked terrible, thin and pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and she admitted it. She didn't realize how serious his feelings for me were until it was too late. She swiped through picture after picture, each one worse than the last. She told me she thought Colin would get over the breakup in a few weeks, like his previous relationships. But this time he'd completely shut down. She confessed she'd been to 3 family therapists who all told her the same thing. She caused this by messing with our relationship. And she finally understood she destroyed her son's happiness. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper, and she wouldn't look at me when she talked. I asked her, "Why on earth would you think I would help you after everything you did to drive me away?" She said she didn't deserve my help, but Colin did, and she was willing to do whatever it took, including staying completely out of our lives if we got back together. She reached across the table like she might grab my hand, but stopped herself, leaving her hand hovering. I stood up to leave, and she started crying again, begging me to just think about it. I stood up from that coffee shop table and walked toward the door without looking back. She called my name, but I kept going, pushing through the glass door into the parking lot where the afternoon sun hit my face. My car sat 3 rows back, and I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking from anger, or maybe something else I didn't want to name. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, watching through the window as she stood outside the coffee shop in trance. Phone pressed to her ear. She was probably calling Colin right then to tell him she tried. The engine started, and I backed out of the parking space, forcing myself not to look at her again. Traffic moved slow on the way home, and I gripped the steering wheel, thinking about everything she said. The photos of Colin looking like death. Her tears that might actually be real this time. My phone sat in the cup holder, and I glanced at it twice before pulling over into a gas station parking lot. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Celine's name, the one person who was there when I met James and knew the whole messy history. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. I told her about the coffee shop, about the photos, about how Diane looked genuinely broken instead of just manipulative. Celine listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked the question I'd been avoiding since James made dinner last night. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I'd been dating James because his family was easy, because his mom smiled when I walked through the door, because there was no battle to fight. But easy wasn't the same as right, and I didn't know how to explain that without sounding ungrateful. Celine told me to be honest with myself before I made any decisions, and we hung up after she made me promise to call her tomorrow. I sat in my car outside the gas station for another 10 minutes before driving home, my mind spinning through memories I thought I'd packed away. That night, James made pasta and asked about my day. I couldn't lie to him about where I went or who I saw. He set down his fork and looked at me across the table, really looked at me, and asked if I was thinking about Colin. The truth came out easier than I expected. I told him yes, that Diane's visit had stirred up everything I thought I'd moved past. He nodded slowly and said he appreciated me being honest instead of pretending everything was fine. We finished dinner in quiet, and he didn't push me for more. Didn't demand I make a choice right now. Just held my hand while we cleaned up the dishes. The next morning at work, I couldn't focus on my patients. My supervisor noticed, asking if I was okay during my lunch break. I told her I was fine, but she didn't believe me and suggested I take the afternoon off if I needed space to think. Instead, I texted Hugo, Colin's friend who worked in the same hospital, asking if we could meet for coffee after his shift. He responded within minutes, saying yes, and suggested a place near the hospital at 6. The rest of my workday dragged. I kept checking the clock, nervous about what Hugo might tell me. At 5:40, I left the rehab center and drove to the coffee shop, arriving early and ordering tea I didn't actually want. Hugo walked in at 6 exactly, still wearing his scrubs. He looked tired in a way that made me think the hospital was grinding him down, too. He sat across from me, and I asked him directly how bad things really were with Colin. No sugarcoating, just the truth. His face went serious. He told me Colin was barely holding it together, that he'd lost something essential that made him good at his job. The attending doctors were worried about him making mistakes from exhaustion and depression, worried he might hurt himself or a patient because he was running on empty. Hugo said Colin worked double shifts, then slept in the on-call room to avoid going home, eating maybe once a day if someone forced food on him. The hospital had made him see a therapist, but Colin just went through the motions, showing up to appointments, but not actually engaging with treatment. Hugo leaned forward and said he thought I was the only person who might actually get through to Colin because nothing else had worked. I asked why he thought that. Because Colin refuses to even say your name, he said. Won't talk about the breakup. Acts like acknowledging what happened would make it too real. Hugo finished his coffee and told me he wasn't asking me to fix Colin, just maybe talk to him once. Then he left for his next shift. I drove home, feeling like someone had dropped a weight on my chest. James was at practice with his team, and I was alone in the apartment, staring at my phone and thinking about Hugo's words. A week passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about what Hugo said. James noticed I was distracted during dinner, during movies, during the normal moments that should feel comfortable. Finally, he asked me straight out if I was thinking about Colin, and I told him yes, because lying would be worse. I explained about meeting Hugo, about learning how bad Colin's depression had gotten, about feeling responsible even though I knew I wasn't. James was quiet for a long time, and then he said he appreciated me not lying to him. That honesty mattered more than pretending. He didn't get angry or defensive, just sad in a way that made me feel worse than yelling would have. That night, I lay awake until 2 in the morning. Then I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My hand shook as I scrolled to Colin's number, the one I never deleted, even though I should have. I pressed call before I could change my mind. It rang once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and on the 5th ring he answered. His voice sounded thick with sleep, and I said his name. Just his name. Nothing else. Complete silence followed, and it stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Thought maybe I imagined him answering. Then he said my name, like a question, like he couldn't believe I was actually calling, like maybe he was still dreaming. We talked for 15 minutes, and his voice sounded hollow, broken in a way that scared me more than Hugo's description did. He apologized for his mother, for everything that happened, for not being strong enough to stand up to her sooner. He said he didn't blame me for leaving, that I was right to protect myself, but he couldn't figure out how to function without me, and he knew that wasn't fair to put on me. I told him he needed real help, actual therapy, where he was honest instead of just showing up. He admitted he hadn't been truthful with his therapist because talking about losing me made it too real, made it permanent. He said seeing photos of me with James on social media felt like proof that I moved on easily while he fell apart. Colin asked if I was happy with James, and I opened my mouth to say yes, but the word got stuck. The pause stretched too long and he caught it. He told me he didn't want to mess up my life again, but if there was any chance I still had feelings for him, he'd do whatever it took to fix things, including finally standing up to his mother the way he should have from the start. I told him I needed time to think, and he said he understood, that he'd wait as long as it took. We hung up, and I sat on my couch in the dark apartment. James was still at practice with his team. Tears ran down my face, and I realized I was crying because I never stopped loving Colin. I just learned how to live without him. Learned to build a life that didn't hurt every single day. I wiped my face and checked the time. James wouldn't be back from practice for another hour. I stood up and went to the kitchen, poured myself water, drank it without tasting anything. My phone sat on the counter, and I stared at it like it might explode. The silence in the apartment felt too loud. I walked back to the couch and sat down again. The cushion still had the indent from where I was sitting before. I should eat something, but the thought made my stomach twist. I picked up my phone and scrolled through nothing, just moving my thumb to have something to do. An hour passed like this. Then I heard James' key in the lock. He came in smelling like grass and sweat, his practice bag over his shoulder. He took one look at my face and stopped in the doorway. I watched him register that something had happened, watched him put his bag down slowly. He sat next to me on the couch and waited. I told him about Colin's call, about the hollow sound in his voice, about how he apologized and said he didn't blame me but couldn't function without me. James listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Then he looked at me and said he'd known for a while that part of me was still somewhere else. He said it so calmly, like he'd been carrying this knowledge around and finally got to set it down. He said he deserved someone who was completely present in the relationship. I started to protest, but he held up his hand. He told me he cared about me, really cared, but he wouldn't be someone's second choice. The words came out before I could stop them. I told him he wasn't second choice. He was the safe choice. The second it left my mouth, I knew it was wrong. I watched his face change, watched him process what I just said. It hurt both of us because it was true, and we both knew it. He stood up and walked to the window. I stayed on the couch. We sat with that truth between us for what felt like forever. Finally, James turned around and said he thought I needed to figure out my feelings for Colin before we could move forward. He suggested we take a break. Not a breakup, just space for me to work through whatever was happening in my head. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't because he was right. I'd been emotionally checked out since Hugo told me about Colin's depression. Maybe even before that. Staying with James while my heart was somewhere else wasn't fair to him. I agreed, even though it hurt. He nodded like he expected this answer. We spent the rest of the evening in careful politeness, both of us moving around each other like strangers. That night, I slept in the guest room. The next week, I moved my stuff back to my own apartment. James helped me carry boxes, which just made everything worse. The apartment felt different from 6 months ago when I first moved in with him. Back then, it felt empty because I was alone. Now it felt empty because I chose to be. I unpacked slowly, putting things back where they used to go. My coffee maker on the counter, my books on the shelf, my photos on the wall. Everything fit back into place, like I never left. Celine showed up that evening with 2 bottles of wine. She didn't ask if I wanted company, just walked in and started opening cabinets looking for glasses. We sat on my couch and she poured. She asked what I was going to do. I told her I didn't know. I said I still had feelings for Colin, but I didn't know if I could trust that things would be different. Diane could be in therapy now, but what happens in 6 months when therapy ends and she decides she's fixed? What happens when Colin and I get serious again and she starts testing boundaries? Celine drank her wine and said that was a valid concern. She asked if I thought Colin would actually stand up to his mother this time. I told her he said he would, but he said that before, too, back when we were together, and it never happened. Celine refilled both our glasses. She told me that people can change, but it takes more than just wanting to. She asked if I was willing to risk getting hurt again to find out. I didn't have an answer. 3 days later, Frank called me. I stared at his name on my phone screen for 3 rings before answering. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I was so surprised I almost dropped my phone. Frank had never reached out during my entire relationship with Colin. He stayed neutral, stayed quiet, let Diane run the show while he watched from the sidelines. I asked why, and he said he needed to talk to me about something important. I agreed to meet him the next morning at a cafe near my apartment. I spent the rest of the day wondering what he wanted. Maybe Diane sent him. Maybe this was another manipulation attempt. I almost canceled twice, but curiosity won out. Frank was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees in front of him. He stood when he saw me, gestured to the chair across from him. I sat, and he pushed 1 coffee toward me. He remembered I take it with cream and sugar. We made small talk for about 30 seconds before he cut himself off mid-sentence. He said he was ashamed he didn't stand up to Diane when she was treating me badly. The words came out rushed, like he'd practiced them. He told me he thought staying neutral was keeping peace in the family. He believed if he didn't take sides, then everyone would eventually calm down and work things out. But he realized now he was just enabling her controlling behavior. He said it cost Colin his happiness, and he'd never forgive himself for that. I didn't know what to say, so I just drank my coffee. Frank kept talking. He explained that Diane's parents were immigrants who came here with nothing. They struggled financially her entire childhood, never had stability or security. Diane grew up watching them work 3 jobs and still barely make rent. She became obsessed with social status and financial security as a result. When she married Frank, she thought she'd finally escaped that instability. She fixated on Colin marrying someone from what she considered the right background, because in her mind, that was the only way to guarantee he'd never struggle like her parents did. Frank said it didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped explain why she reacted so badly to me. She saw my parents' bakery and my normal job and panicked that Colin was choosing struggle over security. I listened to this, and part of me understood, but most of me was still angry. Lots of people grow up poor and don't become controlling nightmares to their kids' partners. Frank told me he'd been going to therapy himself for the past 2 months. He was learning about enmeshment and controlling parenting, about how his silence enabled Diane's worst impulses. He said he'd told Diane she needed intensive therapy if she wanted any relationship with Colin going forward. Real therapy, not just a few sessions to say she tried. He was prepared to separate from her if she wouldn't change. I asked if he meant that, and he looked me straight in the eye and said yes. He said watching Colin fall apart opened his eyes to how damaged their family dynamic had become. He wasn't willing to lose his son to protect his marriage. Diane was in therapy now, actually working on her issues with a therapist who specialized in controlling parents. But Frank said real change takes time, and there was no guarantee she'd succeed. Some people go to therapy and learn to fake progress without actually changing. He didn't know which category Diane would fall into yet. I asked Frank why he was telling me all this. He set his coffee down and looked tired suddenly. He said because I deserved to know the family dynamics before deciding anything about Colin. He wanted me to understand what I'd be walking back into. Diane was trying, but she wasn't fixed. She might never be fixed. If I gave Colin another chance, I needed to go in with my eyes open about his mother. He said Diane had good weeks where she respected boundaries and bad weeks where she backslid into old patterns. Frank was working on holding her accountable, but it wasn't perfect. I appreciated his honesty, even though it made the decision harder. At least he wasn't pretending everything was magically better now. Frank admitted he was terrified they'd permanently damaged Colin and destroyed his chance at happiness with me. His voice cracked when he said it. He told me Colin was always a happy kid, easy to please, eager to make everyone proud. Watching him become hollow and broken had been the worst experience of Frank's life. He said if I decided to give Colin another chance, he'd personally ensure Diane respected boundaries, even if that meant she didn't see Colin for a while. Even if that meant choosing between his wife and his son, he'd choose his son this time. I believed him because I could see it in his face. The guilt and determination mixed together. He stood to leave and put his hand on my shoulder for just a second. He told me to take my time deciding, that Colin would wait as long as I needed. Then he was gone, and I was sitting alone with cold coffee and more information than I had before, but no clearer answer about what to do. I spent the next 2 days replaying Frank's words in my head while I tried to work. My patients noticed I was distracted, and one of them asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but she gave me this look like she knew I was lying. On Thursday morning, I called the therapist my insurance covered and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. The receptionist said they had a cancellation, and I took it before I could talk myself out of going. The office was in a building downtown with beige walls and generic landscape paintings. I filled out paperwork asking about my mental health history and relationship status, and I realized I didn't know what to put for that last one anymore. The therapist was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Walsh, who had kind eyes and didn't push me to talk before I was ready. I told her about Colin and Diane and the breakup and James and Frank's visit and how I didn't know what I actually wanted anymore. She listened without interrupting and then asked me what I wanted. Not what I thought I should want or what made the most sense. I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out because I hadn't let myself think about it that way. She waited, and I finally admitted I wanted Colin. But I was scared of going through everything with Diane again and ending up more hurt than before. Dr. Walsh wrote something down and asked why I was more scared of being hurt again than I was the first time. I thought about it and realized it was because last time I could tell myself we just weren't meant to be. But if I try again and it fails, I'll know for sure that even love isn't enough to fix some situations. Dr. Walsh pointed out that I left James' stability to even consider Colin again. She said that suggested my feelings ran deeper than I'd been admitting to myself. I wanted to argue, but she was right, because James was everything I thought I wanted after the disaster with Diane. His mother liked me, and his life was simple, and there was no drama. But I still couldn't stop thinking about Colin, even when I was sitting at James' family dinners. Dr. Walsh said the question isn't whether I love Colin, because clearly I do. The real question is whether I believe the situation can actually be different this time, or if I'm setting myself up for the same pain. She asked what would need to change for me to feel safe trying again. I listed things like Colin setting real boundaries with Diane and sticking to them even when it's hard, and Frank actually backing him up instead of staying neutral, and Diane doing real therapy work instead of just going through the motions. Dr. Walsh asked if I thought those things were possible, and I said I didn't know. But Frank seemed genuine when he talked about choosing Colin over protecting his marriage. I left therapy feeling more confused than when I went in, but at least I was thinking about the right questions now. That night, I texted Hugo and asked if we could talk. He called me 20 minutes later, and I asked him honestly about Colin's therapy progress. Hugo said something shifted after our phone call, and Colin finally opened up to his therapist about everything. He was going to sessions twice a week now and actually being honest about his depression instead of pretending he's fine. Hugo said Colin's therapist thought he was making real progress, but it was going to take time. I asked how much time, and Hugo laughed and said that's not how therapy works. There's no finish line where suddenly everything is fixed. But Colin was trying, and that was more than he was doing before. Hugo asked if I was thinking about giving Colin another chance, and I told him maybe, but I needed to see the changes for myself first. He said that's fair and told me Colin asked about me sometimes, but never pushed Hugo to share information. I appreciated that because it meant Colin was respecting my space, even though I knew he wanted to talk. 2 days later, I texted Colin and asked if he wanted to meet for coffee. He responded within a minute, saying yes and asking when. We agreed on Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments. I spent the next 3 days alternating between thinking this was a huge mistake and hoping things could actually be different. Saturday came, and I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early because I was nervous. I ordered tea I didn't really want and sat at a corner table where I could see the door. Colin walked in exactly on time, and I barely recognized him at first. He'd lost more weight than I realized, and his face looked thin and pale. He had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept properly in months. He spotted me and walked over, and something broke open in my chest seeing him like this. I stood up, and we did this awkward half-hug, then sat down across from each other. Colin apologized right away for how he looked. He said he knew he was a mess and he was working on it. I told him he didn't need to apologize for that, and we sat in uncomfortable silence for a minute before he asked how I'd been. We talked for 2 hours about everything that happened, and Colin took full responsibility for not setting boundaries with his mother sooner. He didn't make excuses or try to blame Diane's behavior on her childhood or anything like that. He just said he should have protected our relationship, and he didn't, and he was sorry. I told him I was sorry too, for giving up without fighting harder, but he shook his head and said I shouldn't have had to fight at all. He said his mother's behavior was wrong, and he should have shut it down from the beginning instead of trying to keep everyone happy. Colin told me he'd been working with his therapist on understanding why he let Diane control his relationships for so long. He explained that he was raised to keep peace at all costs and to prioritize his mother's feelings above everything else. His therapist helped him see that he never learned it was okay to choose his own happiness over her approval. He said growing up, anytime he disagreed with Diane, she would cry or get angry or give him the silent treatment until he apologized and did what she wanted. His father would tell him to just go along with it to keep the peace. So he learned that his own needs didn't matter as much as keeping his mother calm. His therapist called it enmeshment and said it was going to take work to unlearn those patterns. Colin says he's committed to doing that work because he can't live like this anymore. He talked about how empty he'd felt since we broke up and how he finally understood that his mother's love came with conditions that were destroying him. I listened and watched his face while he talked, and I could see he meant it. This wasn't just words to get me back. He'd actually thought about this and worked on it. Colin said he wasn't asking me to take him back right now because he knew he needed to prove he was actually changing. He asked if I'd be willing to stay in contact while he worked on himself, and maybe eventually we could try again if I was still open to it. His voice cracked a little when he said it, and I realized how hard this was for him, asking for something without knowing if he'd get it. I told him I still had feelings for him, but I was scared. I needed to see real change before I could consider getting back together, because I couldn't go through that nightmare with Diane again. Colin nodded and said that's fair. He promised he'd do whatever it takes, including family therapy with his parents and maintaining strict boundaries with Diane. He said he'd rather lose his mother than lose me again, and I believed him because I could see it in his eyes. We finished our coffee and walked out together. Colin asked if he could text me, and I said yes. He didn't try to hug me again, just said thank you for meeting him and walked to his car. I watched him go and felt this weird mix of hope and fear. Over the next few weeks, Colin and I texted regularly about small things, like how our days went and what we were watching on TV. We met for coffee 2 more times, and I noticed he was gaining weight back and looked healthier. His eyes weren't as hollow, and he smiled occasionally when he talked about work. He told me his therapist said he was making genuine progress and learning to recognize when he was falling into old patterns of putting his mother's needs first. Colin started going to the gym again and picked up his guitar that he hadn't touched in months. I could see him coming back to life slowly, and it made me want to believe things could work. Then Diane called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I stared at her name on my phone screen and almost didn't answer, but I picked up and she asked if she could apologize in person. I was immediately suspicious because this felt like another manipulation. I told her no, then hung up and called Colin right away. He said his therapist actually thought it might be helpful for Diane's accountability if she apologized to me directly. He offered to be there as a buffer if I agreed to meet her. I thought about it for 2 days before texting Diane that I'd meet her, but only with Colin present. She agreed immediately, and we set up a time for the following Saturday at a restaurant. Saturday arrived, and Colin picked me up from my apartment because we agreed it would be better to show up together. The restaurant was one of those places with white tablecloths and servers who refilled water glasses every 5 minutes, somewhere neutral that didn't belong to any of us. Diane was already sitting at a corner table when we walked in, her hands folded in her lap. She stood up when she saw us, like she wasn't sure if she should hug Colin or shake my hand. She did neither, just sat back down and waited for us to take our seats across from her. Colin pulled out my chair, and I noticed his hand was shaking slightly when he touched my shoulder. Diane launched into her apology before the server even brought menus, and I could tell immediately someone coached her on what to say because the words sounded practiced. She apologized specifically for her racist comments about my family being immigrants, for telling me the wrong address to Colin's birthday party, for showing up at my apartment to drive me away. She listed each thing like items on a checklist, and her voice stayed steady and controlled the whole time. When she finished the first part, she took a breath and started explaining that her therapist helped her understand she was trying to control Colin's life because she felt powerless in her own childhood. She talked about how her parents struggled with money and status, how she grew up feeling like she never had enough, how she became obsessed with making sure Colin had security and connections. The whole time she was talking, I was watching her face, and I could see she meant some of it. But there was something rehearsed about the delivery that made me wonder how much was genuine understanding versus what her therapist told her to say. She admitted she saw me as a threat to her relationship with Colin instead of seeing me as a person, and she was working on understanding why she felt so threatened by someone her son loved. That part sounded more real, more painful, and her voice cracked a little when she said it. Diane promised she'd respect whatever boundaries Colin and I set going forward, including limited contact or only seeing us with supervision. She said she'd rather have a distant relationship with Colin than no relationship at all. And she finally understood she was destroying the exact thing she was trying to protect. Her eyes filled with tears when she said this, and I believed that part completely because I could see the fear in her face, the terror that she'd lost her son forever. But then I noticed something that bothered me. Every few sentences, she'd glance at Colin, checking his face for approval or reassurance, looking to see if she was saying the right things. I watched this happen 3 times before I pointed it out, telling her she was still looking to Colin for validation, even while apologizing for trying to control him. She got defensive immediately, her shoulders stiffening and her mouth opening to argue. But then she caught herself and closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them again, she admitted I was right, that it was a habit she was trying to break, but it was harder than she expected. The server came to take our order, and the interruption felt awkward because none of us had even looked at the menus. We ordered quickly just to get the server to leave, and then we sat in uncomfortable silence while Diane twisted her napkin in her lap. After Diane left, walking to her car with her shoulders hunched like she was carrying something heavy, Colin and I stayed at the table and talked about whether her apology felt genuine. I told him she was clearly working on things with her therapist, but she still had those controlling instincts just below the surface. And I was worried about what happens when therapy ends and real life tests whether her progress is real or just performance. Colin stared at his untouched food and nodded slowly, and I could see he was thinking the same thing. He said his therapist warned him that his mother's change would be gradual and imperfect, that she spent decades building these patterns and they wouldn't disappear just because she understood them. The difference now, he said, looking directly at me, is that I'm committed to maintaining boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when my mother cries or my father calls, asking me to give her another chance. He continued, his voice firm, I'm not going to sacrifice our relationship to manage his mother's feelings anymore. And I could hear in his voice that he meant it. We finished our meal without much appetite and drove back to my apartment in silence that felt thoughtful rather than tense. The next morning, I was making coffee when my phone buzzed with a text from James asking how I was doing and if I'd made any decisions. I stared at the message for a long time before responding because I knew what I needed to tell him, but I hated that it was going to hurt. I texted back honestly that I was exploring things with Colin again, trying to see if we could make it work with proper boundaries around his mother. James responded within minutes, saying he appreciated me being straight with him, even though it hurt, and that he hoped I knew what I was doing. I did know what I was doing, or at least I thought I did. But there was still that voice in my head asking if I was making a huge mistake by giving Colin another chance. I deleted the text thread and put my phone face down on the counter because looking at it made my chest feel tight. 2 months passed and Colin and I fell into a routine of weekly dinners and daily texts, rebuilding what we had before, but slower this time, more careful. Diane called him once a week on Sundays, and he kept the conversations short, ending them when she started asking too many questions about me or suggesting we all get together. Frank called me once during this time to thank me for giving Colin another chance, and I could hear the relief in his voice when he talked about how much better Colin seemed. Then Colin invited me to a family therapy session with him, his parents, and their therapist. And my first instinct was to say no because sitting in a room with Diane sounded like my personal nightmare. But Colin said his therapist thought it would be helpful for everyone to be in the same space with a professional mediating. So I agreed, even though my stomach dropped at the thought. The therapy office was in a medical building with bland artwork on the walls and furniture that looked like it came from a catalog. Colin and I arrived first and sat in the waiting room holding hands, both of us tense and quiet. Diane and Frank showed up exactly on time, and Diane's face did this complicated thing when she saw me. Something between hope and fear and shame all mixed together. The therapist was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and glasses, and she greeted us all calmly, like we were here for something routine instead of trying to repair a family that nearly destroyed itself. We sat in a circle, me and Colin on one small couch, Diane and Frank on another, and the therapist in a chair between us. Diane spent the first 20 minutes trying to prove she'd changed, talking about her therapy homework and the books she'd reading about controlling behavior and enmeshment. She sounded almost eager, like a student trying to show the teacher she did the assignment. And I noticed Colin shifting uncomfortably beside me. The therapist let Diane talk for a while and then started pushing her on specific scenarios, asking what Diane would do if Colin and I got engaged, if we decided to move away, if we wanted to spend holidays with my family instead of hers. Diane started suggesting compromises that sounded reasonable at first, but when I listened closer, they were just softer versions of control. Little ways she could still influence our decisions and stay involved in every aspect of our lives. The therapist called out Diane's behavior directly, telling her she was still trying to negotiate outcomes instead of accepting that Colin's life isn't hers to manage. Diane got upset immediately, her voice rising as she said she was trying her best. She was in therapy twice a week, she was reading books and doing exercises, and what more does everyone want from her? Frank spoke up for the first time and supported the therapist, telling Diane she needed to accept that trying isn't the same as succeeding and she still had significant work to do. Diane turned to look at Frank with this expression of betrayal, like she couldn't believe her own husband was siding against her, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. The session ended with Diane crying quietly into a tissue while the therapist talked about the difference between understanding your behavior and actually changing it, and I left feeling exhausted and sad for everyone involved. After the session, Colin and I sat in his car in the parking lot, and he looked more discouraged than I'd seen him in weeks. He said he was worried his mother would never really change, that she'd always have these controlling instincts just waiting to come out. And maybe we were fooling ourselves, thinking we could have a relationship without her destroying it again. I reached over and took his hand, and I told him what mattered was that he was changing and learning to hold boundaries, that we could work with an imperfect Diane as long as he didn't let her run our lives. He squeezed my hand and nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that his mother's problems would always be our problems, too. We sat there for a while longer, watching other people come and go from their therapy appointments. And I wondered if we were strong enough to build something real with all this damage in the background. A week passed before Colin called and asked if we could meet for coffee. I spent those 7 days going back and forth in my head about what I actually want, whether I'm ready to try again, whether anything would really be different this time. I thought about Diane's tears in the therapy office and Colin's face when he talked about losing me. And I thought about the 2 years before everything fell apart when we were actually happy together. I met him at the same coffee shop where we had our first real conversation after the breakup, and he looked nervous when I sat down across from him. He didn't waste time with small talk, just asked directly if I was ready to try being together again, officially, with clear boundaries about his mother's involvement. I told him I'd been thinking about it constantly and I wanted to try, but I needed specific agreements about how we'd handle Diane going forward. He nodded immediately and said he expected that he wanted the same thing because he couldn't go through losing me again. We talked for 2 hours about what being together would actually look like, what rules we'd need, what would happen if Diane crossed lines. I told him I needed a few more days to think about the specifics and write down what I actually needed from him. And he said he'd do the same so we could compare notes. 3 days later, we met at my apartment, and we both brought notebooks with our lists written out. We sat at my kitchen table and went through everything point by point, writing out actual rules about Diane's access to our relationship. No surprise visits to either of our places, period. No comments about my family or background. And if she makes one, Colin shuts it down immediately and we leave or end the call. Phone calls limited to twice a week maximum, unless there's an actual emergency and Colin gets to define what counts as an emergency. If Diane tries to manipulate or guilt trip, Colin ends the conversation right then and follows through with consequences, like reduced contact for a set period. I told him if he breaks these boundaries, even once, if he lets her slide on something because it's easier or he feels guilty, I'm done for good and there won't be another chance. He looked me in the eye and said he understood that he'd rather lose his mother completely than lose me again. And I believed him because I could see how much the last 7 months had broken him. We decided to start dating again, officially, taking things slowly and checking in regularly about how things were going. Colin suggested weekly conversations where we specifically talk about any Diane issues or concerns so nothing builds up under the surface like it did before. I agreed and added that I wanted him to keep going to therapy even when things were good, not just when there's a crisis. And he said his therapist already recommended the same thing. We wrote everything down and both signed it, which felt kind of formal and weird, but also necessary given what we'd been through. After we finished with the rules and boundaries, we just sat there looking at each other, and Colin reached across the table to take my hand. He said he knew we had a long way to go to rebuild trust, but he was committed to doing whatever it takes, and I squeezed his hand back because I wanted to believe we could actually make this work. The next day, I texted James and asked if we could meet in person. He responded right away, saying he'd come over after his shift ends. And when he showed up at my door that evening, he already looked resigned, like he knew what was coming. We sat on my couch, and I told him straight out that Colin and I were getting back together, that I was sorry, but I needed to be honest that my heart wasn't fully available for anyone else right now. James was quiet for a long moment and then said he was sad but not surprised, that he could tell for weeks I was somewhere else emotionally. He said he hoped things worked out with Colin, but if they don't, I shouldn't call him as a backup because he deserved someone who chooses him first. I told him he absolutely deserved that respect, and I wouldn't contact him unless it was to genuinely see how he was doing as a friend. Nothing more. He nodded and stood up to leave, and at the door he turned back and said, I think you're making a mistake going back to someone whose family caused you so much pain. But I hope you're right that things will be different this time. Colin and I went on our first real date in 7 months the following weekend. Dinner at a restaurant neither of us had been to before, so there's no history attached to the location. It felt both familiar and different sitting across from him, ordering food and talking about our weeks. He was more confident about standing up for what he wants, interrupting me at one point to say he disagreed with something I said instead of just nodding along like he used to. I was more willing to speak up when something bothered me instead of trying to keep peace, telling him directly when a comment he made about my work schedule sounded dismissive. We both noticed the changes and talked about them, agreeing that maybe we needed this time apart to figure out how to actually communicate instead of avoiding conflict. The date went well enough that we scheduled another one for the next week, and then another, slowly building back the relationship without rushing into the intensity we had before. 3 months into dating again, Colin came to my apartment one evening looking lighter than I'd seen him in months. He told me he had a major breakthrough in therapy that day where he confronted his fear of disappointing his mother head-on. His therapist walked him through exercises about whose expectations he's living for, whether his mother's approval is actually necessary for his happiness, what he's willing to sacrifice to maintain her good opinion. Colin said something clicked during the session where he finally understood that his mother's disappointment is not his responsibility to fix, that her emotional regulation is her own work to do. He talked for an hour about the insights he had, how he'd been carrying guilt about her feelings since childhood, how he confused love with obligation. I listened and watched him process out loud, and I could see the weight lifting off his shoulders as he talked through it. Diane tested the boundaries several times over the next few months, calling Colin's phone repeatedly when he didn't answer the first time, leaving voicemails with subtle comments about how I must be keeping him too busy to talk to his mother. She mentioned during one call that she saw someone from my neighborhood, and they said my parents' bakery had been struggling, implying I might be with Colin for financial security after all. Each time, Colin shut it down immediately, telling her the comment was inappropriate and ending the call, then following through with consequences, like not answering her calls for a week. After the 3rd or 4th time, Diane started learning the boundaries were real, that Colin meant what he said about reducing contact if she couldn't respect the rules. Frank called me separately to apologize for her behavior and assure me he's backing up every consequence Colin implements, even when Diane complains to him about being shut out. Colin's attending physician called him in for a meeting 5 months after he returned to limited duties, and Colin was nervous it was bad news about his performance. Instead, the doctor told him he was cleared to return to full duties at the hospital after seeing his progress in therapy and his improved mental health scores. The doctor said Colin's work had been consistently strong, his focus was back, and the other physicians had noticed he's genuinely excited about cases again instead of just going through motions. Colin came straight to my apartment after the meeting, practically bouncing with excitement, and told me this was the first time in almost a year that he'd felt like himself at work. He wasn't using the hospital to hide from his feelings anymore. He was actually engaging with patients and colleagues, and the difference was obvious to everyone around him. Frank took me aside one day when I was at their house for a brief, supervised dinner, and he thanked me for giving Colin another chance. He said watching Colin come back to life over the past few months has been incredible. Seeing him laugh again and make plans for the future instead of just surviving day to day. Frank told me he's committed to making sure Diane never threatens our relationship again, that he's prepared to choose his son's well-being over his wife's comfort if it comes to that. He admitted he should have done that years ago, that his neutrality enabled Diane's controlling behavior, and he won't make that mistake again. I thanked him for the support and told him it means a lot that Colin has at least one parent fully in his corner. 6 months after Diane's desperate plea at my workplace, Colin and I are in a stable relationship with clear boundaries around his family. We have dinner with his parents once a month, always at a restaurant, always with a set end time. Diane is still in therapy, and improving slowly, though she has setbacks where she reverts to old patterns and Frank has to intervene. She's learning to ask about my day without making backhanded comments, to talk about Colin's work without suggesting he's making poor career choices by prioritizing our relationship. The progress is slow and imperfect, but it's progress. And Colin maintains the boundaries consistently, even when it's uncomfortable. We talk every week about how things are going, whether any concerns are building up, whether we're both still committed to making this work. So far, the answer is yes. And I'm starting to believe we might actually build something lasting this time, something that can withstand his mother's issues because we're both strong enough to hold the line together. Colin and I spent 2 weeks looking at apartments before we found the right one. It was a third-floor walk-up in a building neither of us had lived in before, with big windows that let in morning light and a kitchen that actually had counter space. We signed the lease on a Saturday, and Colin called his parents that night to tell them we were moving in together. Frank congratulated us immediately and said he was happy we were taking this step. Diane was quiet for a long moment before saying that was wonderful news and asking if we needed help with anything. Colin told her we had it covered, but we'd let her know when we were settled in. After he hung up, he looked at me and said he needed to set some ground rules with his mother before we actually moved. We drove to his parents' house the next day and sat down with both of them in their living room. Colin told Diane she could visit our new place, but she needed to call first and give us at least a day's notice. He said she would not be getting a key, and she couldn't just show up whenever she felt like it. Diane started to protest and say that seemed extreme for family, but Frank cut her off and told her those were reasonable boundaries that she needed to respect. She looked hurt and asked if I was the one who wanted these rules. Colin said no. He wanted them because he needed to know his home was his space and not somewhere his mother could invade. Diane's face went tight, but she agreed after Frank gave her a look that said she didn't have a choice. We moved in 3 weeks later, and Diane called 2 days beforehand to ask if she could bring us a housewarming gift. Colin said yes, and she showed up with a set of kitchen towels and a strained smile, staying for exactly 30 minutes before leaving without trying to snoop through our things. I'd been putting off dealing with James' stuff for weeks because I didn't want to face him after everything that happened. His sweatshirt was still in my closet, along with a book he'd left and some running gear he'd forgotten. I texted him asking when would be a good time to return his things, and he said Saturday afternoon worked for him. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our places, and I brought everything in a shopping bag. James looked good, healthier than the last time I'd seen him, and there was a woman with him at a table in the corner. He introduced her as Sarah and said they'd been seeing each other for about a month. She seemed nice and gave me a friendly smile before excusing herself to get a refill on her coffee. James took the bag and thanked me for bringing his stuff. He said he was glad I figured out what I wanted, and he hoped things worked out with Colin. I told him I was sorry for how everything went down, for not being fully present when we were together. He said he understood, and he didn't regret our time together because it taught him what he needed in a relationship. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, and then Sarah came back and James stood up to leave. He gave me a quick hug and told me to take care of myself, and I watched them walk out together, feeling relieved that he'd moved on and wasn't angry with me. Colin planned a weekend trip to this little cabin in the mountains 2 hours from the city. He said he needed a break from the hospital and from family drama, and he wanted it to just be us. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, and the place was perfect, small and quiet, with a view of the lake. We spent Saturday hiking and cooking dinner together, and that night we sat on the porch watching the stars. Colin was quiet for a while, and then he got up and went inside, coming back with something in his hand. He sat down next to me and opened his palm to show me a ring, simple and silver with a small stone. He said he'd been carrying it around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He told me he wanted to spend his life with me, that he promised we'd make all our decisions together without his mother running our lives. He said he knew things had been hard and complicated, but he believed we could build something real if we kept putting each other first. I looked at the ring and then at him, And I said yes because I believed he was finally capable of keeping that promise. We sat there for a long time after, not saying much, just holding each other while the night got darker around us. 1 year after the breakup that nearly destroyed us both, Colin and I are planning our wedding and dealing with Diane's struggle to accept her limited role. We picked a date in the spring and booked a small venue that fits 100 people. Diane called 3 times in the first week after we announced our engagement, each time with suggestions about the guest list or the menu or the flowers. Colin shut her down every time and reminded her she could attend as a guest, but she didn't get to make decisions. She called Frank crying after the 3rd conversation, and he called Colin to say he'd handle it. Frank took Diane to her therapy session, and apparently they spent an hour talking about boundaries and why she needed to let us plan our own wedding. She's been better since then, but she still slips up sometimes, mentioning how her friend's daughter had such a beautiful ceremony at the country club or asking if we've considered a different color scheme. Colin stays firm every time, and I back him up, and slowly Diane is learning that her input isn't welcome unless we ask for it. We have dinner with his parents once a month, and it's still sometimes awkward. But Frank keeps Diane in check, and she's trying, even when it's clearly hard for her. Our apartment feels like home now, full of our things and our routines, and we're building the life we should have had all along. It's not perfect and probably never will be with Diane in the picture, but it's genuinely ours, and that's enough. What a journey, right? I mean, who knew one person could cause so much chaos? Have you ever had to draw such firm boundaries with a family member, or perhaps had a similar experience with a challenging in-law? Tell me what you think. I really want to know.